You sit there a little longer than usual after church. Engine off, hands still resting on the steering wheel, the last of the families pulling out to the parking lot, while the worship song from 10 minutes ago is somehow still echoing in your chest. The pastor already gave the benediction. The handshakes are over. Somebody's kids are laughing near the fellowship hall. A couple in the next row is loading a casserole dish into the trunk, heading home to Sunday lunch and ordinary conversation. But you are still there, staring through the windshield because ordinary conversation has become harder when your heart has been carrying something nobody can quite see. You know what it feels like to smile in the lobby, tell people you're doing fine, and then sit in your car as if your soul needs a minute to catch up with your body. You know what it feels like to be looked at and not really seen to be spoken to, but not really understood to be remembered only in the easy seasons and quietly pushed to the side when life got complicated. Some of the people who counted you out did not do it loudly. That is what made it sting. They did it with silence. They did it by withdrawing support. They did it by changing the subject when your name came up. They did it by deciding your hard season was your whole story. But God has not been absent for 1 second of this. He saw every night you sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, trying to make sense of what fell apart. He saw every tear you wiped away before walking into work. He saw every prayer whispered when you were too tired to say much more than, "Lord, help me." And before we go deeper tonight, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and write, "God will make it undeniable" in the comments if this message is already speaking to your spirit, because what looked like silence to people around you was not the end of your story. It was the beginning of a holy reversal, and the same people who misread your quiet season are about to watch God put His hand on your life in a way no one will be able to explain away. Because being counted out hurts in a different way when it comes from people who know your name, and that is the kind of pain polite people do not always know how to talk about. Being dismissed by strangers is one thing. It stings, but it does not settle in the bones the same way. What cuts deeper is when the people who knew your history, who knew how hard you worked, who knew what you had already survived, were the very ones who started looking at you like you were no longer worth believing in. That wound is harder to describe because it is not always dramatic. Sometimes it comes dressed in regular clothes and church smiles. Sometimes it sounds like a relative saying, "You need to be realistic," when what they really mean is they no longer expect anything beautiful to come from your life. Sometimes it sounds like a friend from Bible study who used to call every week, but slowly stopped checking on you once your situation got messy and inconvenient. Sometimes it is a boss who keeps passing you over, not because you are unqualified, but because you are steady instead of flashy. Faithful instead of loud, seasoned instead of self-promoting. And after a while, it starts to feel like people have taken a vote on your future without ever asking heaven what God was still writing. That kind of rejection gets into everyday moments. It follows you home from work. It sits with you at the dinner table. It rides with you to the pharmacy when you are calculating whether you can pick up the prescription now or wait until payday. It is there when you scroll past photos of other people's celebrations, promotions, engagements, grand babies, vacations, and answered prayers, while you are trying to figure out how your own life got so quiet. It is there when you stand at the sink washing dishes and replaying old conversations, wishing you had said something different, wiser, stronger, something that would have made people understand you before they reached their conclusions. For a lot of people in this season of life, especially in America, being counted out does not happen in one giant public collapse. It happens through a series of smaller humiliations that pile up. Your marriage struggled, and some people got uncomfortable, so they stopped inviting you around. Your health changed, and suddenly you were treated like fragility had become your identity. Your work hours were cut, and people who used to respect your effort began speaking to you with a strange tone reserved for those they think are slipping. You helped everybody else move, cook, babysit, give rides, cover shifts, pray late into the night, show up at the hospital, send the card, bring the meal. But when your own season of need arrived, the room got thin. The phone got quieter. The support got lighter. That can make a grown person feel invisible in broad daylight. And what makes it heavier is that by this stage of life, you are not dealing with childish hurt anymore. You are carrying adult disappointments, the kind that show up after decades of loyalty. The kind that hit after raising children, burying parents, surviving layoffs, enduring health scares, rebuilding after divorce, or trying to start over in your 50s or 60s when you thought this chapter of life would feel more settled than it does. There is something deeply painful about realizing that some people only honored your strength when it benefited them. They admired your faith when it looked polished. They celebrated your generosity when it was flowing in their direction. But when the pressure of real life revealed your exhaustion, your grief, your unanswered questions, they quietly revised their opinion of you. They did not always say it out loud, but you could feel it. You could feel the shift in the way they listened. You could feel it in the lack of follow-up. You could feel it in how quickly they moved on from your pain because it interrupted their neat little narrative about what a blessed life is supposed to look like. And that is why being counted out feels like more than disappointment. It feels like being erased while still alive. It feels like people have reduced your whole existence to one difficult chapter. It feels like your years of serving, praying, working, forgiving, enduring, and showing up got pushed to the side because you entered a season they did not know how to interpret. But hear this clearly chosen one. The fact that people misread your season does not mean heaven misread it. The fact that they changed their posture toward you does not mean God changed his mind about you. The people around you may have looked at your pain and called it proof that you were finished, but God looked at the same pain and called it a place of formation. People often judge by visible momentum. God judges by deeper truth. Human beings love tidy testimonies, clean victories, and quick recoveries. But the Lord does some of his most serious work in places where there is no applause, no spotlight, and no audience left to clap. That is why the next part matters so much, because they mistook your hidden season for failure, and many chosen people suffer doubly, because they not only endure the hard season itself, they also endure being misinterpreted while they are walking through it. You got quieter, yes, but not because you had nothing left in you. You got quieter because there comes a point when you can no longer waste strength trying to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You became more selective not because you turned bitter, but because wisdom finally started to separate noise from nourishment. You pulled back, not because you gave up, but because God was drawing you into a place where fewer voices could reach you. And from the outside, people saw less movement and assumed less value. That is how human judgment works. If they cannot see the activity, they assume there is no anointing. If they cannot track the process, they assume there is no progress. If you are not posting every breakthrough, smiling every Sunday, networking every week, and proving your relevance on demand, they decide something must be wrong. But there are seasons when God will reduce your visibility in order to protect your becoming. There are seasons when the holiest thing you can do is disappear from the unnecessary and return to the essential. That hidden season may have looked like turning down invitations because you did not have the emotional strength to sit through another shallow conversation. It may have looked like waking up before sunrise, standing in the dim kitchen light with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm. Bible open, asking God to give you enough peace to make it through one more day without unraveling. It may have looked like driving to work with worship music playing low, because that was the only way to keep your mind from spiraling before clocking in. It may have looked like folding laundry in silence, praying under your breath between towels and t-shirts because the laundry room had become your prayer closet. It may have looked like sitting in the grocery store parking lot after buying only what was on sale, tears pressing at the edges of your eyes because public places have a way of making private grief rise to the surface. It may have looked like skipping social media because watching everyone else perform happiness felt like too much. It may have looked like protecting your little bit of remaining strength from people who wanted access to you, but not responsibility for how they handled your heart. And because America teaches people to measure worth by visibility, output success signals and polished momentum, your hidden season probably looked strange to others. We live in a culture that rewards constant activity. Keep moving, keep selling, keep smiling, keep branding, keep proving, keep producing. So when someone gets still, people assume weakness. When someone becomes private, people assume shame. When someone stops arguing for their own value, people assume defeat. But the kingdom does not work by the same metrics as the world. In Scripture, seeds disappear before they rise. Jesus withdrew often. David was anointed before he was recognized. Joseph carried promise in obscurity before he ever stood in authority. Hidden does not mean forsaken. Stillness does not mean empty. Silence does not mean God has stepped away. Sometimes silence is the greenhouse. Sometimes withdrawal is the wilderness where identity gets stripped of performance. Sometimes the reason you could not keep running in every direction is because God loved you too much to let your exhaustion keep impersonating your purpose. And yes, people saw the change. They saw you stop over-explaining. They saw you stop fighting for a seat at tables that dishonored your spirit. They saw you stop posting every thought, stop volunteering for every burden, stop chasing every relationship, stop trying to rescue people who never planned to respect your sacrifice. They saw less of you and concluded there must be less to you. But what they called collapse was often pruning. What they called isolation was often consecration. What they called your downfall was often God's refusal to let you keep blooming in toxic soil. Pruning is rarely pretty while it is happening. It looks like loss. It feels like reduction. Branches are cut back. Options shrink. Certain relationships fall away. Energy gets limited. Old habits stop working. Places that once felt familiar begin to feel tight. And because pruning removes what is visible, outside observers usually think something is dying. But anyone who knows anything about growth understands that careful cutting is not cruelty. It is preparation for fuller fruit. God was not trying to humiliate you by reducing your world. He was trying to heal you by reducing what had access to you. He was teaching you that not every voice deserves your explanation, not every room deserves your presence, and not every person who had history with you was qualified to walk into your next season. That hidden season was also teaching you how to live with God when there was no audience. And that matters more than many people realize. It is one thing to worship when your life is publicly blooming. It is another thing to trust God when you are opening bills at the kitchen table with a knot in your stomach, when the house is too quiet, when adult children are distant, when your body does not move the way it used to, when people at church ask how you are doing, and you can tell they want the tidy answer, not the true one. Hidden seasons reveal whether faith is a performance or a relationship. They strip things down. They expose what you were leaning on. They show you where people-pleasing had replaced peace, where busyness had replaced intimacy, where being needed had replaced being known by God. And slowly, often so slowly you barely notice at first, your inner life begins to change. You stop reaching for your phone first and start reaching for prayer. You stop needing everybody to validate your pain and start letting God witness it. You stop expecting the crowd to understand what only heaven can explain. You begin to realize that survival is not your only testimony. Transformation is happening too. So no, chosen one, your hidden season was not failure. It only looked that way to people who mistake noise for fruit and visibility for value. What was really happening was quieter, deeper, holier. God was building roots where no one clapped. He was restoring dignity where people had stripped it away. He was detoxing you from the approval of those who only loved the version of you that never needed anything. He was teaching you how to stand without constant reassurance, how to pray without instant answers, how to obey without public recognition, how to heal without announcing it, and how to let him become enough in places where human support had run thin. Outwardly, it may have looked like shrinkage, but spiritually, it was preparation. And when God prepares a life in secret, he does not do it for nothing. And that is exactly why God will often let the room misread you before he reveals you, because there are seasons when heaven does not rush to correct the record, not because the misunderstanding is harmless, but because the misunderstanding itself is exposing something that needs to be seen. You wanted God to step in sooner. You wanted him to interrupt the false narrative, to stop the sideways comments, to shut down the assumptions, to make people see that your silence was not weakness. Your delay was not disqualification, and your suffering was not proof that he had left you. But the Lord in his wisdom will sometimes let a room get comfortable with the wrong conclusion, so that when he moves, nobody can pretend they were the one who made it happen. He let them think you were finished. He let them talk as if your best years were behind you. He let them assume that what hurt you had also defined you permanently. He let them believe that because you were no longer loud, you were no longer called, because you were no longer visible, you were no longer valuable, because you were no longer fighting to be included, you must have finally accepted your place beneath them. And that is where divine strategy begins to look offensive to human pride, because God was never confused about who you were, not for 1 second. He was not absent. He was not indifferent. He was not distracted. He was watching human opinion reveal itself in full daylight. He was letting the room show what it really believed when there was no immediate reward for supporting you. He was letting people expose whether they honored calling or only celebrated convenience. In American life, this does not always happen in dramatic ways. A lot of times it happens through familiar, almost ordinary scenes. You get passed over for the promotion even though you trained the person who got it. You are left out of the group text, and suddenly everybody says it was an accident, but deep down you know it fit too neatly with the pattern. You show up to the holiday dinner, and the conversation shifts around you like people have already decided not to ask how you are doing because they do not want a real answer. Someone makes a joke about you being set in your ways or still figuring things out, and everybody laughs just enough for it to pass as harmless, even though it lands like a splinter under the skin. You sit in church and watch people celebrate other people's testimonies, while your own prayer still feels suspended between heaven and earth, and after a while, even the well-meaning people begin to speak to you with that strange tone that says they have quietly filed you under maybe. Maybe they will get it together. Maybe they had their chance already. Maybe they are just not one of those people God is going to use in a big way. That is what being misread feels like. It is not always an attack. Sometimes it is a quiet downgrade in how people hold your name. But when God is preparing a life for revelation, He often allows that downgrade to happen because He does not want your future to be credited to the approval of people who are never qualified to authorize your destiny. If He had elevated you too early, some of them would have acted like they saw it all along. If He had turned things quickly, they would have called themselves supporters. If He had opened the door before their hearts were exposed, they would have found a way to stand near your breakthrough and speak as if they had helped build it. So, heaven waited. Heaven let the room speak. Heaven let the record show who encouraged you only when it was easy, who drifted when your life became inconvenient, who enjoyed your strength but had no patience for your process, who confused delay with denial, who mistook being hidden for being discarded. That is not cruelty, that is clarity. God will sometimes let human opinion finish talking before He begins revealing. And what made it even harder is that you could feel people getting comfortable with the idea that you would never rise beyond what hurt you. That is one of the loneliest feelings in adult life, especially in the American culture of constant reinvention and outward success, because by the time you reach your late 40s, 50s, or 60s, people start assigning invisible labels. Too late, too complicated, too wounded, too old to start over, too quiet to matter, too bruised to carry anything significant. And once those labels settle in, people stop expecting God-sized things from your life. They begin speaking to you according to your interruption instead of your calling. They measure you by your setback, your divorce, your job loss, your health struggle, your season of grief, your financial strain, your depression, your silence, your reduced visibility, your unanswered prayer. But God does not read lives the way people read lives. Humans love snapshots. God reads covenant. Humans freeze a person in their worst chapter. God sees the whole book and writes endings no room could have predicted. That is why some of the most painful forms of rejection are actually forms of protection. You are not being forgotten. You are being guarded from premature visibility. There are things God cannot reveal too early because the environment around you would mishandle them. Some people cannot honor what they have not suffered enough to understand. Some rooms would have celebrated your gift while poisoning your peace. Some circles wanted access to your oil without ever respecting the crushing that produced it. So God kept you back. He let you stay unseen a little longer. He let people underestimate you until their underestimation became their witness. And one day, the very people who settled into the idea that you were ordinary, late finished, or permanently diminished are going to have to face something they cannot explain by natural logic. Not because you became a performer, not because you finally learned how to market yourself better, not because you manipulated perception, but because the hand of God matured something in private that human opinion had no authority to touch. And once God decides the hidden season has done its work, the reveal does not ask permission from the crowd. It arrives with its own authority. That is why you do not need to panic over who misread you. Let them. Let the room settle into its wrong conclusion. Let the people who only understand visible momentum keep talking about what they think your life has become. Let the ones who assumed your quietness was surrender keep assuming. Let the ones who counted your absence as irrelevance keep counting. Because when God is this involved in a story, misjudgment becomes part of the contrast. He is letting the wrong reading stand for now so that when He turns the page, the difference will be unmistakable. And still even knowing that in your spirit, the breaking point came in ordinary places because revelation does not erase the exhaustion of living through the waiting. The truth is, most people do not break in some dramatic public collapse. They break in regular American rooms with regular American responsibilities still sitting on the counter. It happens in the shower when the hot water is the only thing loud enough to cover the sound of crying. It happens in the pharmacy line while you are trying to decide what can wait until next week and what absolutely cannot. It happens in the living room after everybody else has gone to bed. When the TV is off, the dishes are done, the house is finally quiet, and your mind starts replaying everything you held together all day. It happens in the church parking lot after service, when everybody else seems to know where they are headed next, and you are still asking God what exactly this season is supposed to mean. It happens while driving through neighborhoods you once dreamed of living in, neighborhoods with trimmed lawns and porch lights, and the kind of calm you thought this stage of your life might hold by now. And instead you keep driving back to the same apartment. Same mortgage stress, same unanswered questions, same feeling that you have been rebuilding for longer than anyone realizes. It happens while washing dishes, standing at the kitchen sink, replaying one sentence somebody said 3 weeks ago that still won't leave your mind. It happens while folding laundry, paying bills, staring at the ceiling at 2:13 in the morning, sitting in a doctor's office parking lot, carrying grocery bags into a house that feels too quiet, or watching a Sunday afternoon ball game without really seeing it because your spirit is tired in a way sleep cannot fix. That is where the breaking point came. Not in a spotlight, in the middle of normal life. And that matters because many people listening to this do not have a dramatic testimony full of public collapse and visible rescue. A lot of people are simply worn thin. They are tired of being the strong one, tired of acting okay at work, tired of carrying family burdens no one names, tired of smiling in the church lobby and answering doing well because it is easier than telling the truth. Tired of starting over, tired of praying the same prayer in different words. Tired of seeing people who lied, cheated, manipulated, or coasted seem to get ahead while they keep trying to do things the right way and still end up with less ease, less support, less visible reward. Those are the questions that rise at the breaking point. Lord, did I miss my season? Why did you let them treat me like that? Why do the wrong people seem to keep winning? Why am I rebuilding again? Why does it feel like I always have to be the one who swallows the hurt and keeps going? Why does everybody else's life look like it is moving while mine feels held in place? Those are not polished church questions. Those are real questions, American questions, questions whispered by people who still believe in God but are exhausted by the gap between promise and appearance. Questions from people who tithed, served, stayed faithful, raised their kids, helped their parents, worked the extra shift, kept showing up, and still found themselves sitting in a dark room wondering whether heaven had gone quiet on purpose. And this is where many chosen ones miss what God is doing because they expect Him to meet them first with explanation, but more often He meets them first with presence. He does not always answer every why in the moment you ask it. He does not hand you a neat timeline and say, "Here is what I have been doing since October. Here is why that person betrayed you. Here is why that door closed. Here is why that prayer has taken longer than you wanted." More often, He comes near in ways that do not feel flashy at first. He gives you enough peace to make it through the next hour. He keeps you from saying the thing that would have made everything worse. He puts one scripture in your mind and it stays with you all day like bread you can chew slowly. He sends one person to text you at the right moment. He lets a worship song catch you off guard in the car. and somehow the tears come out clean instead of bitter. He gives you the strength to get out of bed, go to work, smile at the cashier, answer the phone, and make it through another day without your soul collapsing under the weight of all it carries. That is not small. That is sustaining grace. And sustaining grace is often how God introduces himself in seasons where people are past inspiration and in need of oxygen. At the breaking point, you begin to learn that God is not only the God of sudden miracles. He is the God who sits with people in fluorescent kitchens, in old recliners, in pickup trucks, in waiting rooms, in suburban cul-de-sacs, in small-town churches, in late-night living rooms, in the spaces where a person finally admits they cannot carry it all by themselves anymore. He is the God who draws near to the widow, trying to stay strong, to the man who feels humiliated by how much he has had to start over, to the mother whose children no longer call the way they used to the couple silently wondering how much longer they can keep pretending things are fine, to the worker who has become invisible at the office, to the believer who is ashamed of how tired their faith feels. He comes close there, not with condemnation, not with a lecture, not with a demand that you clean up your emotions before approaching him. He comes with the kind of presence that does not always remove the pressure immediately, but refuses to let the pressure have the final word. And often the first sign that God is meeting you is not that your circumstances change overnight. It is that you do not break the way you thought you would. It is that you cry, but you do not come apart. It is that you feel weak, but you are still somehow carried. It is that you ask hard questions, but your heart does not fully close. It is that you keep going, not because you are pretending to be strong, but because something underneath you is holding. That is holy. That is God in ordinary places. And once he begins meeting you there, the breaking point stops being only the place where you ran out of strength. It becomes the place where his presence started becoming more real than the voices that counted you out. And that is where God started rebuilding what people tried to reduce, because heaven does not always answer your pain by changing the room first. Sometimes the first answer is not a new job, a public apology, a financial miracle, or a dramatic reversal that everybody can see by Friday. Sometimes the first answer is quieter and deeper than that. Sometimes God answers by restoring the person the room tried to shrink. He begins where the damage settled. He goes straight to the places in you that got bent out of shape by disappointment, dismissal, exhaustion, betrayal, and that slow drip of disrespect that can wear down even a faithful heart over time. And for a while, nobody around you notices what he is doing, because the first stage of rebuilding is not loud. It does not always change your zip code. It does not always put new keys in your hand or new money in your account overnight. Sometimes it starts with something almost invisible to other people, but unmistakable to you. You begin to feel something returning, not the old, frantic version of strength that was really just adrenaline and survival wearing church clothes. Something steadier than that. Something cleaner. Your discernment sharpens. You begin to notice the difference between who loves you and who only liked your availability. You begin to tell the difference between conviction and shame, between wisdom and fear, between God closing a door and your own insecurity talking too loudly in your head. Your self-respect starts coming back in pieces, and that matters more than many people realize, because when people have counted you out long enough, one of the deepest battles is not only with what they said. It is with what their treatment tempted you to believe about yourself. But then, little by little, you stop needing applause from people who never understood your assignment in the first place. You stop reaching for validation the way a tired hand reaches for the light switch in the dark. You begin to understand that peace cannot live in a life constantly auditioning for human approval. So something changes in the way you move. You start saying no where you used to overextend. You stop showing up to things just because guilt invited you. You stop chasing relationships that drain you and then call it love. You stop pouring into people who only ever contact you in an emergency and disappear the moment you need tenderness in return. You begin to pray differently too. Not from panic, not from that breathless, "Lord, please fix it right now, because I cannot take one more thing" kind of desperation, though. God heard those prayers too. No, this time your prayers start carrying authority. Not loudness, authority. There is a difference. You start praying like someone who has been with God in the hidden place long enough to know He is not playing games with your life. You stop begging to be remembered and start agreeing with what heaven already decided about you. You stop praying like a cast-off and start praying like someone who belongs to the King. And this inward rebuilding shows up in such ordinary American ways that many people would miss it if they were only looking for spectacle. It may look like finally opening the stack of bills on the kitchen counter without spiraling into dread before you even read them. It may look like going back to church and sitting in the same pew without needing anyone to notice you were hurting. It may look like applying for the job you almost talked yourself out of because the culture keeps whispering that people past a certain age are supposed to shrink their expectations. It may look like setting boundaries with adult children you love dearly, but can no longer allow to speak to you from entitlement. It may look like letting a sibling be disappointed because you are finally done being the family's unpaid emotional janitor. It may look like calling a therapist after months of telling yourself you should be stronger than this by now, only to discover that strength sometimes looks like letting God help you through wise people. It may look like cleaning out the guest room or the basement or the corner of the bedroom that slowly turned into a monument to grief, a place where unopened boxes and stale air had become physical proof of how long you were just trying to survive. It may look like sleeping through the night for the first time in months, not because every problem is gone, but because panic is no longer sleeping in your bed with you. And people who have never had to claw their way back from emotional and spiritual depletion may not understand how holy that is. But you understand it because you know what it costs to get there. You know what it means to wake up and realize that for once, your first thought was not fear. You know what it means to drive to work without rehearsing every possible worst-case scenario before you even pull into the parking lot. You know what it means to hear bad news and not immediately come undone. That is not nothing. That is evidence. That is God rebuilding what life and people tried to reduce. It is also why the miracle often starts inside before it becomes undeniable outside. Publicly, you may still look like you are in the same season, same town, same car, same church, same grocery store, same name on the mailbox, same responsibilities, but inwardly the architecture is changing. The foundation is being reinforced. Your center of gravity is moving. You no longer react the same way to the things that used to knock you flat. The text message that would have ruined your whole day 2 months ago now gets a calmer response, or no response at all. The dismissive comment that would have had you replaying the conversation all night now meets a boundary instead of a breakdown. The closed door that once would have sent you into self-doubt now gets met with a slower breath and a quiet God if it is not from you. I do not need it. That is growth. That is rebuilding. That is what happens when the Lord stops merely comforting your pain and starts reconstructing your inner world. And one of the hardest parts of this season is that because the change begins inwardly, Some people around you still think they know you. They think they are dealing with the same version of you they dismissed before. They think your silence still means insecurity. They think your restraint still means weakness. They think your kindness still means limitless access. They think your quiet season left you smaller. But they are about to discover that the people who dismissed you will not recognize the strength God built in secret, because the version of you they judged was not the final version. They only knew you when you were bleeding, grieving over explaining, and trying too hard to be understood by people who had already chosen their opinion. They knew the version of you that kept handing people extra chances because you mistook patience for holy self-erasure. They knew the version of you that worried constantly, answered too quickly, apologized too much, and still thought if you could just phrase things the right way, maybe the room would finally understand your heart. They knew the version of you that was carrying fresh hurt in public and trying not to let it show. But they do not know this rebuilt version. They do not know the one God has been forming in the hidden place. They do not know the one who has learned how to stay calm when disrespected. They do not know the one who no longer panics when a door closes because they have seen God sustain them through enough endings to know that not every closed door is a crisis. They do not know the one who can hear God more clearly now that the noise of people-pleasing has been turned down. They do not know the one who has stopped begging to be chosen by people because they finally know they were chosen by God. And that kind of knowing changes a person in ways that cannot be faked. It changes your eyes. It changes your pace. It changes what you tolerate. It changes the temperature of your spirit. You are no longer easy to manipulate with silence, guilt, crumbs, half-promises, or vague approval. You are no longer thrown off every time someone withholds affirmation. You are no longer desperate to clear your name in every room where you are misunderstood. God has taught you something deeper than image management. He has taught you anchoredness. And anchored people move differently through the world. They still feel, they still grieve, they still get tired, but they are not as easily toppled by every opinion in the wind. In very practical American life terms, this may look like you still clocking in at the same job, but no longer allowing the office politics to define your worth by lunchtime. It may look like you still attending the same church, but no longer needing to perform spiritual wellness so other people stay comfortable around you. It may look like you still hosting Thanksgiving or showing up to family dinners, but no longer shrinking yourself so everybody else can avoid their discomfort. It may look like you still living in the same neighborhood, still shopping at the same store, still chatting with the same cashier, but carrying yourself with a steadiness that comes from having been rebuilt where nobody clapped. You are not louder. You are deeper. You are not harder. You are clearer. You are not bitter. You are boundaried. And those who only recognize the wounded version of you are going to miss this change at first, because secret strength does not announce itself with fireworks. It reveals itself in moments, in your refusal to chase, in your calm response, in the way you do not overreact when overlooked, in the way you walk away from things that once would have kept you awake, in the way your peace now has edges, in the way your joy is no longer dependent on who texted back, who approved, who invited, who praised, or who finally understood. That is why, when the public shift comes, it will not simply be a change in circumstance. It will be the unveiling of a person remade in private. People often think vindication means getting the house, the title, the money, the opportunity, the restored relationship, the public recognition, and sometimes those things do come. But the deepest vindication is when life can no longer produce the same version of you it used to, The deepest vindication is when the thing that once broke you no longer has the same power over your nervous system, your identity, your prayer life, your sleep, your confidence, or your sense of who you are in God. The deepest vindication is when a person who was once reduced by grief, fear, rejection, or confusion stands up inside themselves with quiet authority and realizes, I am not who they left. I am not who they judged. I am not even who I was when I first entered this season. God has been rebuilding me in ways they cannot see. And that is the turn. That is where the story starts glowing under the surface. Because now the coming reversal is no longer built on wishful thinking. It is built on substance. When the opportunity opens, it will meet a steadier you. When the relationship comes, it will meet a wiser you. When the blessing appears, it will meet a less needy you. When the door swings open, it will meet someone who no longer confuses access with assignment. And when the people who dismissed you finally notice the shift, they will not just be looking at changed circumstances. They will be looking at changed substance. They will be looking at a person who still carries tenderness, but no longer lives at the mercy of every opinion. A person who still knows how to love, but no longer calls self-abandonment kindness. A person who still serves, but no longer bleeds for rooms that dishonor what God placed in them. A person who has learned through tears and waiting and prayer and long ordinary days that being chosen by God will eventually cure you of the need to be validated by the crowd. And once that lesson settles deep enough, you become dangerous to every system that depended on your insecurity. You become unhooked from the machinery of approval. You become less controllable, less persuadable by fear, less tempted to step out of peace just because somebody misread your motives. That is the strength God built in secret, not performance, not ego, not revenge. Substance. The kind of substance that lets a person walk through the same town, the same church lobby, the same family circle, the same office hallway, and yet carry a different atmosphere because heaven has rebuilt their core. So yes, chosen one, the miracle is already happening even before the room fully sees it. God is rebuilding what people tried to reduce, and the people who dismissed you will not recognize the strength He built in secret, because He did not just comfort you in private. He remade you there. And that is why God's vindication will not need your defense, because one of the most exhausting burdens a person can carry is the belief that they have to explain themselves into being understood. So many good people lose years of peace trying to clear up confusion that was never innocent to begin with. They rehearse conversations in the car. They rewrite text messages in their head while loading groceries into the trunk. They stand at the sink washing coffee mugs from the morning and think of all the things they should have said at the family gathering, at the church luncheon, in the office or hallway, on that phone call that left them feeling smaller than they were before it started. They imagine finally saying it perfectly, finally finding the right words, finally laying out the facts in such a neat and compelling way that the people who misjudged them will suddenly stop, soften, and say, "You know what? We were wrong about you." But that moment rarely comes the way people hope it will, because misunderstanding is not always rooted in lack of information. Sometimes it is rooted in lack of love. Sometimes people understood enough. They just preferred the version of the story that kept you beneath their comfort. Sometimes they already knew your heart, but the truth of your heart was inconvenient to the role they had assigned you. And that is why the Lord in His mercy eventually begins to free you from the exhausting ministry of self-explanation. He does not ask you to run from house to house, inbox to inbox, pew to pew, trying to prove you are not who Than made you look like for one difficult season. He does not require you to stand trial before every relative who formed an opinion while you were bleeding, every former friend who withdrew when your struggle stopped being tidy, every church circle that reduced your complexity to a prayer request and then moved on, every co-worker who decided your quietness meant weakness, every observer who saw one chapter and declared themselves qualified to narrate the whole book. There comes a point where heaven says enough. Enough explaining to people committed to a simpler version of you than the one God actually made. Enough over-clarifying your motives to people who benefit from pretending not to understand them. Enough exhausting your nervous system trying to be read correctly by people who had every opportunity to ask care, listen, or stay and chose not to. Vindication is coming, but it is not coming through argument. It is coming through evidence. It is coming through fruit. It is coming through peace. It is coming through the kind of settled strength that cannot be staged. It is coming through healed character, through open doors that no human connection can honestly claim credit for, through timing so precise it silences coincidence through favor that arrives too cleanly to be explained by networking strategy, manipulation, or luck. This is where so many chosen ones begin to breathe again, because for a long time you thought your responsibility was to manage everybody else's interpretation of your life. You thought if you could just say, "It better be calmer, be kinder, be clearer, be more patient, be more detailed, be less emotional, be more polished," maybe then people would stop reducing you to your hardest season. But God is not building your future on the shaky ground of public consensus. He is not waiting for your name to be cleared in every room before He blesses what He planted in you. He is not asking for unanimous approval from the people who counted you out. He is not taking a vote. He is not conducting a survey among those who misread your silence and mistook your delay for disqualification. He is God. And when He decides to establish something in your life, He does not need your closing statement, your defense attorney, your 5-page explanation, or your final emotional essay. He lets the results speak. He lets the fruit answer. He lets the changed life preach the sermon. This hits so deeply in American life because so many people, especially by the time they reach midlife and beyond, are bone tired from trying to prove they are not the worst thing they went through. A woman survives a divorce, and suddenly people talk to her as if failure is stitched into her name. A man loses a business or gets laid off, and the room quietly recategorizes him as diminished, even if he still has wisdom, dignity, grit, and calling in his bones. A parent goes through strain with adult children and carries the shame of being judged by people who only know fragments. A believer walks through depression, burnout, or grief, and church people who know how to quote scripture but not always how to sit with suffering start acting strange around them, as if sadness is contagious or confusion is a character flaw. Then the chosen one begins the exhausting work of trying to get ahead of the story. They explain the context, they soften the facts, they add disclaimers. They tell their side carefully so no one thinks they are bitter. They make themselves smaller in the telling so others will stay comfortable. They keep trying to manage perception while quietly bleeding under the table. But there is a holy moment when God starts cutting those cords. He begins teaching you that not every misunderstanding is an emergency. Not every false impression requires a correction. Not every rumor deserves your oxygen. Not every room is mature enough to handle the truth of your process. And not every person who wants access to your story has earned the right to hear it from your mouth. That is not pride. That is stewardship. That is discernment grown up into backbone. It is also one of the clearest signs that healing has matured in you, because wounded people often feel compelled to over-explain in order to keep connection. Healed people learn that connection maintained through self-betrayal is too expensive to keep, so you start letting silence do some of the work. Not cold silence, not punishing silence, not ego, peaceful silence. The kind of silence that comes from finally understanding that God can defend what He authored. The kind of silence that no longer panics when somebody else gets the story wrong. The kind of silence that says, I do not need to drag my soul into court every time somebody misinterprets a chapter they were never anointed to narrate. And once that lesson settles in, something loosens inside you. Your shoulders stop carrying what was never yours to carry. Your jaw softens. Your sleep changes. Your prayer life changes. Even your conversations change because you are no longer speaking from the fever of being misunderstood. You are speaking from a quieter center. In ordinary life, that might look like not responding to the passive-aggressive text right away. It might look like letting a relative tell their version of events at Thanksgiving without taking the bait to turn mashed potatoes into a courtroom. It might look like showing up to church without feeling the need to perform your piece for people who were never there in your private pain. It might look like hearing that somebody heard something about you and simply deciding not to chase it down because the version of you God is building cannot be sustained by rumor and therefore cannot be destroyed by it either. It might look like going to work doing your job with excellence and refusing to waste the whole drive home re-arguing an interaction with someone who needed you insecure in order to feel tall. It might look like telling fewer details to people who have mistaken access for entitlement. It might look like not posting the subtle status update, not sending the paragraph, not volunteering the whole explanation just because somebody raised an eyebrow. That is freedom. That is what it feels like when the need to be understood by everybody starts dying and the need to be aligned with God starts taking its rightful place. And then, almost without fanfare at first, the evidence begins to gather. Fruit starts appearing where panic used to live. Peace starts showing up where overthinking once made a home. The thing about real vindication is that it does not usually arrive as one dramatic trumpet blast. It comes like sunrise. Quiet, steady, undeniable. It starts with the fact that you do not react the same way anymore. It continues with the fact that the door you thought you needed closes, and instead of unraveling, you feel a strange steadiness. Then a different opportunity opens, one you did not manipulate, one that fits more honestly, one that comes with less striving attached to it. Or maybe the financial picture starts shifting not in a flashy overnight way, but in a clean, ordered way. A bill gets covered. An unexpected chance appears. A burden lightens. A skill you carried for years in obscurity suddenly finds the right place. A person of integrity notices you. A conversation happens at the right time. A new sense of authority rises in the way you pray, the way you decide, the way you move. And the people who once reduced you to one bad season begin to notice something they cannot quite label. They may not apologize. Some will not. Human pride is a stubborn weed, but they will see the evidence. They will see the fruit. They will see that peace has returned to your face. They will see that your voice has changed, not louder, but clearer. They will see that doors are opening around you that they did not arrange. They will see that your life is no longer agreeing with the old story they told about you. That is vindication. Not necessarily that everybody confesses they were wrong, though sometimes God is kind enough to allow that too. The deeper vindication is that reality itself starts contradicting the lie. The deeper vindication is that your life becomes too whole to fit inside the category they made for you. The deeper vindication is that the same people who once spoke as if you were fading now have to witness fruit growing where they predicted permanent winter. And there is something else beautiful about God's way of doing this. When He vindicates, He protects your heart from turning it into revenge. Because if all you wanted was to win an argument, you would still be emotionally tied to the people who misread you. If all you wanted was for them to finally admit it, your peace would still be hanging from their mouths. But God loves you too much to make your healing dependent on other people's self-awareness. So He builds something better. He gives you a life that no longer requires their confession in order to feel real. He gives you joy that does not wait on their apology. He gives you direction that does not depend on their agreement. He gives you enough of Himself that by the time the evidence becomes visible, you are no longer starving for the audience's reaction. You are grateful, yes. You are relieved, maybe. But you are not desperate. You are not standing there with your arms crossed saying ye. You are standing there with the quiet astonishment of someone who knows that if God had not held them together, none of this would be possible. That is why real vindication carries humility in it. It does not need to gloat. It does not need to spike the football in the end zone. It does not need to embarrass anybody to feel complete. It simply stands there radiant and calm while the facts do their work. And this is crucial for the chosen one listening tonight, because some of you are still tempted to spend precious strength trying to prepare your defense before the miracle arrives. You are still mentally drafting the speech you will give when the breakthrough comes. You are still imagining who you will send the screenshot to, who you will correct, who you will finally set straight. But the Lord is pulling you out of that posture. He is teaching you a better one. Let Him answer. Let Him establish. Let Him vindicate. Let Him put His hand so clearly on your life that argument becomes unnecessary. Let Him do it in a way that leaves no room for human boasting, including your own. Because the answer that comes from God has a different texture than the one you would force for yourself. It comes without the aftertaste of striving. It comes without you having to chase everybody down. It comes without you needing to narrate every injustice. It comes with fruit, with peace, with timing, with settled authority, with open doors, with a rebuilt inner life, with a kind of favor that lands softly but changes everything. And when that begins to unfold, the people who only knew the wounded version of you will realize they were reading an early draft and calling it final. The ex-friend, the skeptical relative, the church observer, the dismissive co-worker, the ones who watched your silence and assumed collapse. They will all be standing in the presence of evidence they did not manufacture and cannot deny. Some will stay quiet. Some will suddenly become warmer. Some will act as though they were always in your corner. Some will never say a word. But none of that will matter the way it used to, because by then, God's answer will be speaking louder than your explanation ever could. And that is the freedom of this section of the journey. You are no longer required to drag your pain through every courtroom of human opinion. You are no longer assigned to manage everybody's version of your story. You are no longer responsible for making blind people admire the light. God's vindication will not need your defense. It will stand on its own feet. It will arrive with receipts. It will bloom where people expected barrenness. It will settle where chaos once ruled. It will open what man could not. It will restore what fear tried to hollow out. And when it does, you will understand that the energy you once spent trying to explain yourself was better spent becoming the evidence. And that is why what God is about to do will happen in front of the same people who wrote you off, because heaven does not always move you to a brand new audience before it reveals what it has been building. Sometimes God leaves you right in the same town, right around the same relatives, right near the same church. Foyer, right within sight of the same co-workers, neighbors, and old observers who quietly decided your story had already peaked. Not because he wants to embarrass anyone for sport, and not because this is about petty revenge, but because revelation has a holy purpose. The people who dismissed you need to see with their own eyes that struggle was never the same thing as disqualification. The co-workers who overlooked you, the family members who spoke down to you over turkey and sweet tea at Thanksgiving. The church people who got awkward and quiet when your life stopped looking tidy. The neighbors who watched your hard season and assumed God had stepped away. These are often the very people who end up witnessing the evidence. And the evidence may not arrive in a way the world usually celebrates first. It may be restored peace before it is public success. It may be the return of financial stability after years of barely stretching a paycheck to cover groceries, gas prescriptions, and one more surprise bill. It may be healed confidence after a long season of feeling like every room had already made up its mind about you. It may be influence that rises naturally, not because you campaigned for attention, but because people start feeling the weight of God on your life and cannot ignore it anymore. It may be a ministry nobody saw coming, a quiet voice becoming a trusted one, your prayers carrying authority, your words carrying comfort. Your presence carrying steadiness in rooms that used to make you feel small. It may even be a relationship marked by real honor after years of loneliness. Not the kind of shallow attention that leaves you emptier, but the kind of care that reflects God's order and not your old wounds. Whatever form it takes, it will not feel cheap. It will feel sacred. Because the point is not for you to stand there with a wounded grin and finally enjoy people choking on their own bad opinion. The point is that God is going to make something plain. He is going to make it plain that the person they dismissed was never disqualified. He is going to make it plain that your hidden season was not punishment, your silence was not collapse, and your delay was not divine rejection. He is going to let the same eyes that misread you witness the fruit of what he never stopped building. And once that begins, you start realizing that you are not about to become someone else, you are about to be revealed. That is the part many people miss, because pain has a way of making you feel like the answer must be reinvention. The culture tells you that if you want a different outcome, you need a different personality, a louder brand, a younger face, a flashier presence, a sharper performance, a more polished version of yourself that people will finally approve of. But God is not preparing you to become artificial. He is not asking you to become louder than your nature, shinier than your truth, or more marketable than your calling. You are not about to become a performance. You are about to be uncovered. The strength was already there. The wisdom was already there. The depth, the endurance, the compassion, the spiritual weight, the calling, the steadiness, the tenderness that survived hard years without turning cruel, it was all there. Pain hid it. Betrayal buried it. Delay tested it. Grief sat on top of it. Fatigue clouded it. Other people's low expectations threw dirt over it, but none of that erased it. It only concealed it for a season. And this is where the message reaches straight into the heart of the person who feels too old, too late, too bruised, too unseen, too ordinary to still expect a meaningful chapter ahead. Maybe you are in your late 40s, 50s, or 60s. And there are nights when you sit in a recliner with the lamp on low, the house finally quiet, and wonder whether the most significant part of your life already came and went while you were busy surviving. Maybe you raised children, kept working through exhaustion, sat in church with a broken heart, buried. People you loved, watched money disappear, watched friendships fade, watched confidence drain out of you, one disappointment at a time. And somewhere under all that responsibility and grief, you quietly started believing that your moment must have belonged to some earlier version of you. But this is where heaven says no. You are not buried. You are planted. There is a difference. Buried means ended. Planted means hidden on purpose for a future harvest. Buried means forgotten. Planted means prepared. Buried means the story is over. Planted means something is working underground that other people do not have the patience or discernment to recognize yet. So when God reveals you, He is not unveiling a stranger. He is unveiling the truest version of who you have been becoming all along, under pressure, under prayer, under delay, under discipline, under mercy. And that brings us right back to the opening image, because the same people who counted you out are about to see what God never stopped building. You are still sitting there in that car after church, same hands on the steering wheel, same town outside the windshield, same errands waiting, same dishes. Probably waiting in the sink at home, same bills, same ordinary life on the surface. But something inside is not frantic anymore. Something inside has settled. You are not begging heaven for proof that your story matters the way you once were. You know now that silence was not abandonment. Delay was not denial. Being overlooked was not the same thing as being forgotten. The people who counted you out saw one chapter and judged the whole book. But God stayed in the story. He stayed through the humiliation. He stayed through the waiting. He stayed through the crying, the rebuilding, the lonely obedience, the quiet prayers. Nobody heard the Sunday smiles that cost more than anyone knew. And now you are stepping into a season where what God has done in you will become visible. Not for ego, not for revenge, but so His faithfulness can no longer be denied. The ones who dismissed you are about to witness the evidence, the peace, the strength, the favor, the authority, the restoration. And when they do, it will not just say something about you. It will say something about the God who kept His hand on you the whole time. He is about to make you undeniable.